As we continue on in our program this morning, I'd like to invite up Savannah Barrett as she provides us with today's welcome. Savannah Barrett is the Exchange Director for the Art of the Rural and the co-founder for the Kentucky Rural Urban Exchange. Savannah is a passionate organizer and leader who has taught me so much about authentic relationships and the power of creative placemaking. She is the proud mama to Sylvia, brand new baby on the scene. So if you would, please join me in welcoming Savannah Barrett to the stage.
See if I won't fall over. Good morning, y'all. How are you? How about last night? So to make me feel better and also welcome you in doing the same, I'm going to invite you to go back to something that meant a lot to you last night, something that stirred you, something that inspired you, challenged you, or changed you. So if you will, close your eyes. I'm going to go back to that green space under that live oak. I think a moment that gave me particular joy was handing my baby to my friend Annette and watching her bring pure joy out in Sylvia June. Thank you for that, Annette. I want you to find something that gave you equal joy. What did it smell like? What was the light like? What did it feel like to stand on that ground in Utica? Just be there for a moment. Feel that experience. And take this moment of reflection to catalog somewhere in your heart what you learned in that moment. What's going to stick with you from Utica, Mississippi? Come back to us. All right, now that we're in the spirit, I want to bring something from my home state of Kentucky here with you today. It's a poem by the former Kentucky Poet Laureate George L. Lyon, who's from Harlan County. Here we go. The meadow does not know about the stock market. Today she is worth exactly what she was worth yesterday, a year ago, at creation. I don't mean property value, taxable assets. I mean milkweed and copper moths, honeybees, cow vetch, king snakes. Meadow life is not money. What rises and falls here are stems and flowers, leaves and fruit. No zigzag line of profit and panic, but the great wheel turning. Here God gives of her extravagance, and here, like flicker, viceroy, dragonfly, we come into our inheritance. I heard that poem for the first time when I was driving down here along the Mississippi Delta, starting in Kentucky and moving into Tennessee. And I was thinking about all of you. I was thinking about Vickie Benson and what I was going to say when I introduced her. And I felt lucky that I heard this on this new Pine Mountain record that y'all should go look at. Because the poem reminded me of the importance of listening, and that's the value that comes up first and last in this work for me. Listening teaches us that everything and everyone is worth something, and that our places are worthy of our careful stewardship. Listening also reminds us that we are in a learning relationship with our land. This regard for land and the connection between us and our places instructs us towards the values of neighborliness and teaches us how to be in relationship with a place, but also with one another as neighbors and as friends in our communities, but also across them, in folks who are like us and folks who are different from us, because it teaches us that the diversity of an ecosystem is its strength. And when we listen to what's different in a space, we learn something important about ourselves. So I offer that as a a testament to what the rest of the country has to learn from rural people and places. We know how to listen, and we know how to take care of our places and one another. Sometimes we need to learn that lesson again. Sometimes we forget from one generation to the next, but it's in our bones. I hope that we can all, in the next couple of days, be inspired by the places that we experience, by the amazing beauty and graceful stewardship of these places in Mississippi, and take something home with us that reminds us of how to be better neighbors to our friends at home and our friends across the country. The reason I wanted to bring forth listening as I introduced Vickie Benson is because she's one of the best listeners I've ever met. About a year ago when she was in grief, her first solution was to drive across 3 states in search of sandhill cranes so that she could listen to them. And I could also tell you that Vickie is the arts program director for the McKnight Foundation, but you could decide which would tell you more about how she leads her work. I also want to share that this moment on the Rural Generation Summit, this stage, this day, and the consideration of the rural dimension of equity, I think is one of the most important things we can do together. You know, Holly Sidford will be up here soon, and she'll tell you about the Not Just Money report, and that only 2% of arts philanthropy supports rural places, and that organizations serving rural communities, organizations serving people of color, and organizations serving Indian country all combined are just right around 10% of arts philanthropy. That also should tell you that we have a lot in common. Folks of color, regardless of where they live, folks living in Indian country, folks living in rural communities are experiencing some of the same opportunities and challenges, and working together across this field is an amazing opportunity to share some things that we know from our communities with the broader field, and to redefine for ourselves what equity really means in this landscape. You know, it's my belief that rural places have a lot to share, that Indian country has a lot to share, that we know how to deeply connect with one another across difference because we have to do so to survive, and that that's one of the most important lessons that we can share in this moment when our country is experiencing this sort of crisis of isolation. So I think that arts philanthropy should invest in rural people and places at an equitable rate because it's the right thing to do. But if that doesn't work, I think they should invest for their own sake so that they can have opportunities like we had yesterday in Utica and like we'll have in Indianola to connect across difference and across new ways of knowing folks. So with that, please join me in welcoming Vickie Benson.
I'm going to invite our distinguished panel to come up on stage. Thank you, Savannah. That was beautiful. I'll introduce you soon. Is Jennifer here? There she is. Thank you, Savannah. I'm taking that in. I'm remembering the sandhill cranes. I'm trying not to cry. Good morning, y'all. Or in Minnesota, you all. We have a powerful panel here this morning, and I'm honored to be on this stage with these folks. And first, I want to say that I do not live in a rural community, and I've never lived in a rural community. And the reason that's important for me to say as a funder, interesting, what Savannah just said, is that I cannot know what it's like. I cannot know what the wants and needs of rural communities are, but I can listen. And it's important for funders to listen and not to assume that we know what communities want and need. That's why we have these wonderful folks on this panel to talk about their experiences. That's why you're here. But it's really important. I can't underscore it enough for funders to not make assumptions. Before I introduce the panel, and this is where the slide comes into play. Anyone? Anyway, I'll speak and we'll wait for the slide. But I need to acknowledge someone very important in my work as an arts grant maker. In the spirit of Carlton's powerful keynote address yesterday, there is no me as an arts grant maker without Dr. D. Antoinette Handy Miller. She was the director of the music program at the National Endowment for the Arts, my first grant-making employer 30 years ago this May. Antoinette, as she was preferred to be called, was born in New Orleans, was a professionally trained classical musician, a flutist, and as a Black woman in the 50s, she had to go to Europe to perform in a symphony orchestra. And it was not that conductors in this country didn't know her, they did, and they knew her talent. She was a friend with Leonard Bernstein. When she came back to the US, she's a scholar. She wrote the definitive book on Ellis Marsalis' jazz journey. She also wrote Sweethearts of Swing, about the first jazz ensemble of women. And as my boss at the NEA, I learned a great deal from Antoinette about equity, or the lack of it in our country, and about grant making and grace. Antoinette believed in me, gave me a chance, a position. And while we were in DC, Antoinette always talked about her love of Jackson, Mississippi. And after the NEA, Antoinette came to Jackson. She was a faculty member at Jackson State University. And she passed away here and is buried here. Thank you, Antoinette. So again, there is no me in arts grant making without Antoinette. Google her, you'll find a picture of Antoinette and her books. And now to our panel. Holly Sidford is co-director of Helicon Collaborative, a national consulting firm that works with artists, cultural organizations, foundations, and other creative enterprises to make communities more vital, adaptive, and just. In addition, Holly has 30+ years leading cultural and philanthropic organizations, and I believe you knew Antoinette. Yes. Recent studies led by Holly include Not Just Money, Equity Issues and Cultural Philanthropy, which we'll draw from today. Alex Gibson, in the center, is executive director of Apple Shop, a cultural and education center located in Whitesburg, Kentucky, that many of you celebrated their 50th anniversary last night. Yay. Before joining Apple Shop, Alex practiced law within torts, insurance, and business litigation in prominent firms in Louisville and Philadelphia. And he has studied international comparative law in London and Thai and Southwest Asian studies in Thailand. Ron Ragin, on the end, far end, is researcher, strategist, organizer, and interdisciplinary artist. Ron has worked the field of arts and cultural philanthropy for more than a decade, including the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, William and Flora Hewitt Foundation, and at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, Ron was senior research analyst. Ron also sustains a vibrant performance and creative writing practice rooted in music of the African diaspora, improvisation, liberation aesthetics, and spiritual technologies. Ron's roots are in rural Georgia. Liegh McInnis is a poet, short story writer, instructor of English at Jackson State University, the former publisher and editor of Black Magnolia's literary journal, and the author of 8 books, including poetry, short fiction, and literary criticism, including, okay, listen up, Lyrics of Prince, a literary look at a creative musical poet, philosopher, and storyteller, which is music to this Minnesotan's heart. And Jennifer Martell, next to Ron, enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Reservation who resides and works on Standing Rock Reservation. She is coordinator of the Sitting Bull Visitor Center at Sitting Bull College, where she welcomes visitors and tourists from all over the world. Jennifer has degrees in business administration and management from Sitting Bull College and Oglala Lakota College. She has gained knowledge and understanding, having good rapport and relationships with artists locally and nationally. Please help me welcome our panel. As you know, rural is often defined by other people as what it is not. Today, our panel is going to shed light on what rural is. In equity, we heard, those of us who were at Art Place, we heard Jeremy Liu from PolicyLink the other day talk about PolicyLink's equity mandate. And I pulled their manifesto, and a few things resonated with me. I won't read the entire piece, but equity demands honesty and forthrightness, calling out racism and oppression, both overt and systemic. It strives for the power to realize our goals while summoning the grace to sustain them. Equity is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. I'm now going to take the microphone and sit next to Holly. Ooh, we are a crammed stage here. Hello. We're good. I'm good. Hello. So as I said, Holly and Helicon did the research and published Not Just Money, which is a 2017 research study on equity issues in the arts funding in the United States. The study followed the examination of the same topic that started with a report fusing art, culture, and social change. That was published in 2011. We've asked Holly to lift up information from the report, in particular, information that focuses on rural aspects of the data and racial equity and other equity aspects. So Holly.
Thank you, Vickie. Thank you, Vickie. And it's wonderful to see this wonderful, bright sea of faces and to be among you. I want to thank everybody who's contributed to making this gathering happen, particularly to Savannah and Matthew and the working group that organized this. It's a lot of work and it's really paying off. But I also want to take just 1 minute to thank Carlton again. First for that, how to describe it, that speech he gave yesterday morning, which is still reverberating in my soul. But I want to, but I also want to thank you for your hospitality and your inspiration, taking us to Utica yesterday, which was just a great experience. And finally, I really want to thank you for being the perfect model of fierce and creative and generous leadership. You've taught so many of us so much, and I'm very honored to consider you a friend. So I wanted to thank you. As we were out there in the sun and the shade and sipping various drinks yesterday, and Carlton was on the porch, that beautiful raking light, telling us a little bit about the development of sip culture, which is the moment that Savannah's invocation this morning made me think of, him standing on the porch. He talked about that moment when he received word that he'd received, or sip culture had received $500,000 from Art Place. And there was a great whoop, a huge cheer went up in the group. And I think that happened because of three reasons. One, a great hurrah for our friend. Everybody just felt the joy of that gift. But second, it was an appreciation that it was real money equal to the power and potential of the idea that is represented in subculture. And 3, it was a recognition of just how unusual such a gift is. We all know that a $500,000 gift to a startup in Utica, Mississippi is unheard of, literally. So that is the context of this, my remarks. And not just money's online. Savannah gave away my best lines already. But basically, my wonderful colleague, Alexis Fraz, and I have been engaged in a almost 10-year inquiry into funding patterns as regards equity. We focus primarily on private foundations for want of resources and time to do the rest, but there are studies to be done about public funding and individual funding in this regard as well. But our study in 2011, which Vickie referenced, showed that 55% of all grants, gifts, and contributions went to 2% of cultural institutions in this country. 55% of the money, 2% of the institutions. And you know who those institutions are. They're the 900 organizations that have budgets over $5 million a year. The report went into a variety of other themes, and we hope was illuminating, but it did cause a little bit of a stir. And there was a lot of chatter and wringing of hands after it happened. Probably no accident that it landed just at the time that Occupy Wall Street was taking off, so we kind of hit the zeitgeist. But the study wasn't important because it told anybody anything that they didn't know experientially. It's just that we gave some hard numbers to the data. I mean, to the experience. We actually gave people some hard numbers and some arguments to make a change. So fast forward 5 years go by, and Alexis and I say, well, you know, what's happened? Has anything changed? We don't see a lot of change, but let's see what the numbers say. So we set out to do another study, not exactly the same as the first, but another one to look at trends and where they were going. And with help from the Surdna Foundation, thank you very much, Judy Lee Reed, we undertook the second study. And I'll just highlight a few of the findings. First, we found that foundation leaders and nonprofit organizations of all kinds are showing more concern for issues of equity, inclusion, excuse me, and diversity than they had in prior terms. So there was a lot of activity that went on between 2011 and 2016. Discussions, training programs, an increase in anti-racism and anti-bias training, a few funding initiatives focused on underserved artists or underrepresented communities, some increase in interest in community-based practice and socially engaged practice, and a new recognition that in some places process is the product, a new understanding that doesn't all come out of studios. And some new research. But despite all this activity, the data showed that, in fact, the money was getting worse. In the course of those 5 years, it went from 55% to the 2%, close to 60%. In other words, the bigger institutions are getting more of the pie. And concurrently, of course, smaller organizations are getting less. This disparity is even starker for you all. For organizations based in rural communities, 20% of our population live in communities that are designated rural, but only 2% of foundation money goes there. Less than 2%, excuse me, people of color represent 37% of our national population, but organizations explicitly serving organizations of color, excuse me, people of color, communities of color, receive just 4% of arts funding. And close to 50% of our population are low income or below the poverty line, and only 3% of arts funding goes to organizations that are explicitly working with those communities and populations. We also found that this national picture is systemic, but it also is mirrored at the at the local level. The patterns in different places replicate or actually exaggerate the national pattern. We didn't have the resources or really the time to go into great depth about the rural situation or what's happening in Indian country, which is a study that needs to be done. But we did profile 10 cities and showed that in some places, for example, the stark disparities are even more graphic than at the national level. In Boston, for example, 22 groups received 90% of the money. And even in quote unquote majority minority cities like Los Angeles, where 72% of the population are people of color and 24% of the cultural community are organizations focused on communities of color, only 8% of the money goes to those organizations. So it's not a pretty picture. The study also showed that San Francisco is the exception that proves the rule among the 10 cities that we studied, and that sustained and systemic work to bolster the health and welfare of mid-sized and smaller groups and to work on issues of cultural equity pay off. So that as those of you, anybody here from the Bay Area or Northern California? Yeah. As you know, for 20 years, private funders in the public sector have been working on this. And our study found that in 2016, 32% of groups in the Bay Area characterize themselves as organizations of color dealing with low-income populations, LGBTQ populations, or the disabled. There were 32% those groups in the population as a whole, and approximately 32% of the money went to those organizations. So this just shows that it's not fixed. It's created and can be uncreated. Why is this? Why are these patterns true? We can spend the rest of today and many months talking about the history of philanthropy and all that that entails and the development of the cultural sector. But one other thing that we studied in this report was the patterns, the demographic patterns of staff and board members of arts funders. And we found that 92% of the presidents of art foundations are white, 87% of board members are white, 85% of the executive leadership positions are held by white people, and 68% of staff positions of arts foundations are held by white people. So therein is one reason why this pattern persists, because they are the ones making the policies and making the distribution decisions. I'll just make one final point, which is that our study showed, again, what you know and live day to day, that groups serving people of color, rural communities, and lower income communities face distinct financial and organizational challenges. You have less capacity to earn money and to attract contributed money. You have less access to grants of substantial size because grant programs, by and large, are tagged to the size of budgets, organizational budgets. So if you are a lower side of the equation of budgets, you have less access to the big money. There's less capacity. You have less capacity to develop reserves and generate your own investment income. And you have lower percentages of full-time staff than your counterparts that are larger, which you all know reduces your ability to think long-term, to plan, to sustain programming of different kinds. It's also more difficult for you to take risks, to endure setbacks, to invest in your own development. And you are more reliant on both foundation funding and public sector funding than your counterparts, which makes you much more susceptible to changes in those policies. So this is especially true in rural organizations who have actually the least access to funding of any kind. Our study goes into some patterns with individual funders, and I will just say this, that foundations get a lot of attention, and they should, and a lot of criticism, and they should. But in the pie of the economy of culture in this country, about 50% of income is earned through tickets and sales and what have you. Thank you. About 33% comes from individual donations. About 15% comes from foundations, and about 5% comes from public sources. So you can see where the money is, and while foundations And public sources really need a lot of pressure. We need to work on the other side too. So I'll stop. But I just want to say in conclusion that that's why we were all cheering yesterday for the $500,000 grant from Art Place, because it's so unusual, but also it acknowledges that change is possible, that these are policies, actions, decisions that groups can make. And bless you, Art Place, but we hope you're not alone in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. We'll ask Holly a follow-up question after our other panelists have spoken about their experiences in rural communities about the recommendations that came from the report. But let's turn to the other four panelists. And we'll move right down the row, starting with Liegh. And I'm wondering if you could talk about arts and culture in rural communities, your experience, what is important to the people and to you, so setting a context, each of you, for your own work in your communities, which are different from every other community. We don't want to make an assumption that we're all the same in this. So, Liegh.
Sure. So, I'm originally from Clarksdale, Mississippi, home of the blues. So I was blues born, blues bred. When I die, I'm gonna be blues dead. And in the invocation from my sister from the Mississippi Choctaw Nation, I am from Red Panther County. I am from Coahoma County. I actually have a poem about the day when I was 16 years old and learned that Coahoma meant Red Panther, and I would love to share that poem with you. And so my work as both a poet and a short story writer is to do kind of two things. One is to speak to and for Afro-Mississippians. And one of the things that I like to do is, most people in this room don't know, because most people in the nation don't know, that the state of Mississippi is actually 3 separate land masses. So you have the Delta area, you have the Central Pine Belt area, and then you have the Southern Coastal area. Well, why is that important? Because every time you all see Mississippi in Hollywood, you see what? The slow talking, very one-dimensional, monolithic notion of what it means to be from Mississippi. And so as long as that's the only image you see of Mississippi, then you become skeptical of, do I want to do business with people from Mississippi? Do I want to publish writers from Mississippi, right? Do I want to shoot films in Mississippi? So my job as both a poet and a short story writer is to create art that shows the multiplicity of Afro-Mississippians, and I sprinkle in a few white folks too, right? So, so what I've learned is that my wife and I developed a literary journal, so I end on this so you can kind of see work. So we published for 8 years a literary journal titled Black Magnolia's Literary Journal, and it was started to publish Black people in Mississippi. How we were publishing people from Croatia, I have no idea, but that's another discussion for another time. But the reason that we began publishing that, because what I realized was that very monolithic notion of what people outside of the state see about Mississippi was infecting the minds of young Afro-Mississippians. I was conducting a creative writing workshop, and a young Black male had written this wonderful short story. It was a great short story. And I assumed the short story was set in Mississippi, but there was one problem. It had a subway in it. Everything else was Mississippi, but it had a subway. Now I'm trying, how do I talk to this 15-year-old kid who's written this brilliant short story that has a subway in it? So after I assured him it was a wonderful story, I love the characters, I love the imagery, I love the plot, the climax was wonderful, but I just, is that a subway? And he's, yeah. And so I asked him, I said, why is there a subway in a Mississippi story? And he said that because every story I've ever read has a subway in it. Which meant that he had never read a story about an authentic Black Mississippi experience. And so I immediately gave him Richard Wright's Black Boy. I immediately gave him Richard Wright's Native Son. I immediately gave him Margaret Walker's Jubilee. And so for me as a poet and a short story writer, the goal is to, as we all know, that the people in the Delta are not the people in the Pine Central area, and the people in the Pine Central area are not the people in the coast, because I'm from the Delta, my wife is from the coast. People in the Mississippi coast are crazy. Don't tell my wife that, because I'm scared of my wife. But, and so that's the kind of work that I want to do, and that's what we did with Black Magnolias for 8 years, is that we gave a voice. We made sure that 20% of the magazine was for first-time writers, so first-time poets, first-time short story writers, and we also wanted to make sure that we told as many different stories about Black folk, not just so the rest of the world could see that Black people were multidimensional, but that our own Afro-Mississippians could see that.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
A little bit tired. Thanks for having me. I'm Alex. I'm from Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and I did drink this coffee all before I knocked it over. I went to, just following up, I went to high school here in Mississippi at Pawnee Woods, historically Black high school. Ooh, yes. And it was also just going on representation and Black folk. It helped me understand the role Mississippi played in the civil rights movement and in Black history in America. And it was also the first time in my life that I called a Black man and woman doctor. And that was stunning to me at that age. I had never met a Black person who had the title doctor. But in Pawnee Woods, there were many of them. So it was very interesting to see. There's this, there's this thing I discovered. I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, and it was a very race-aware situation. I was the only dark-skinned person in a town of a lot of light-skinned people. So I learned a lot of things, to play basketball, because their favorite player was Larry Bird, but their second favorite player had to be somebody else. Larry Bird was good, but and so I traveled. Grew up hating the area, really resentful, and there's not much there of value. So when I speak about myself, the way you feel as a kid is that there's not much there of value, and that's what the television tells you that we were just referring to. This is the same story about the Appalachia that is the one of the Simpsons on the front porch with the XXX jug. I have actually played a jug before, but it was an irony, So this is what you're taught, and people and teachers and even parents, if they're being kind or thoughtful, will sometimes say to you, you need to leave. And so if you're, I'm going to tie this in a second. This is going to seem like a non sequitur, but if you're a person of color, or if you're LGBTQ, or if you're liberal to a certain degree, then you need to leave in order to have a life. You need to go to Cincinnati or Philadelphia or Atlanta or something like that. And so you get this flight of people that are not conforming to. So when I traveled abroad, it really helped me understand and contextualize what was going on back home. I went first to rural Mexico, and then I got to hear the insult, "Your mother's indigenous," from ethnic majority, mestizo, mixed people, European background people, to the indigenous people there, that was an insult. I got to see that the people that I lived and worked around couldn't have access to. They were dying of dehydration in some circumstances, yet they were the water source for the country. I saw people on donkeys traveling forever. I saw them ridiculed as drunk, as uncivilizable, whatever the better word for that is. Have too many kids, fight too much. And then I traveled to Thailand, and I'm in north of Thailand, and I'm staying with the tea farmers and the rice farmers, and these people are Karen, they're Lisu, they're Lawa, they're Hmong. They're not Thai. Thai is an ethnic identity as well to a nation. But the reason they were farmers is because they're drunk, they're uncivilized, they have too many kids. Then I travel further into Europe, and then I meet the Roma people, yeah? Should I continue? I go to law school in England, and I hear about the Poles coming over. I hear about the Irish, about people in Liverpool from Londoners, those Scousers. So I start to see a theme eventually of the way larger nations and urban centers need to describe the resource gatherers that keep their lights on in order to justify that dichotomy. And we're not talking about an accident. We're talking about a repeatable phenomena that happens in every nation that any person in this room comes from. So it's an interesting element. This is why I said that about leaving earlier, and I said I was going to come back to. There's this scene. Now imagine I have a great memory and then I've looked this up, and so now I give you this exact quote, and so you all are like, wow, how did he do that? So just give me, There's this scene in Merchant of Venice. Yeah, very famous. And Shylock's trying to be talked down, and they're saying, hey, give up this pound of flesh nonsense. He loaned money to someone who didn't pay him back, and in the old rules, you could get the gold or you could get the same amount in flesh. And Shylock was a Jew in a segregated Italy where he was treated quite badly, and so he wanted the flesh. And he goes on this speech that people know, if you prick us, we not bleed, But at the end of that, there's this little gem that I've kept with me for 20 years of life that has helped me understand the Middle East, Africa, Appalachia, Zapatistas. And it's this line that says, "We will perfect the villainy you teach us." An interesting element that happens here in funding to rural areas, these stats that Holly gave, when we see things like a Black Power fist, or we see things like a rebel flag, or we see monuments or rallies or people that need to flee if they're slightly different. By funding, by exposure to arts and culture, when was the last time some of my neighbors in Eastern Kentucky, if not for Apple Shop, would have had falafel, would have seen a belly dance, would have interacted with someone of a different faith, religion? It would not typically happen. So what would be the likely political orientation? And if every other person who has a different cultural expression needs to leave in order to actualize that, we create the villains we fear. See Brexit, see the entire elections of nationalist right-wing people across Europe, see our elections in America. When people feel so isolated, when they feel so separate, when they feel fundamentally unfairness is happening in their life, they segregate off and create parallel societies. And then the larger society needs to explain why that's happened. And that talk can be somewhat cold, distant, and dehumanizing. So my only point here is that, by continuing to subsidize life in urban centers where you have, better transportation, we're encouraging people to go, to continue to, we're making it easier for that to happen for them. These subsidies don't exist in rural America. And so it's becoming progressively more and more difficult to make a rational life exist in rural America. It's almost an irrational economic choice. Yet here's the final denouement. We've never known a world in which we've had 100% urban population. So what are we trying to do? Just make it hell and justify it by impact numbers? Well, you'll never fix the front porch if you're putting it in your monthly budget. It will never necessarily be a priority unless you think about the house as a whole. But can this country think about the house as a whole?
Thank you. Jennifer.
Good morning. Thank you for throwing me up here. I didn't expect this, but as a Native American, again, I'm not a drunk, lazy. I have 4 kids. I have an education. There's such a stigma about us. I work at the visitor center. We have people all over the world that come. So what came about with our art programs basically just having the opportunity to have so many people, every walk of life, come through the door. Curiosity. I like to always ask, what brings you? Usually it's Sitting Bull, or they heard about Standing Rock, or they're passing through. And just having discussions with everybody, talking with people, just kind of getting an idea of what they think of us or who they think we are. And it went into play where the vice president of the college where I work, she said there's an opportunity through the American Indian College Fund. It's a grant for preserving traditional art and culture. Do you want to try it? I'm like, sure, let's do it. And I sat there and I thought about it and was like, how can I make this happen? How can this be workable? How can this be set in place for my people? So what basically we started out, and we're 5 years into it, we do art and culture. I wasn't raised on a reservation, and I came back to help my people. And one of the things is I myself was displaced in my own culture, my language. And I was like, if we do this, we have to get back to who we are again. And maybe we'll get back to our sense of identity and sense of self-esteem and be able to have some motivation to be who we are. So we started out, and like I said, we're 5 years into it. We do a great amount of art classes. We have our culture bearers and our master artists that come and teach the classes. We're now at the point where we're moving towards food sovereignty. We're getting our people to, once again, we were stewards of the land. Just getting back to who we are. And as time has gone on and being recognized, or visitors asking more and more questions, I'm seeing a sense of understanding, where you come to the reservation and you hear the horrific poverty numbers. They're drunks, they're lazy, economic development. I always tell people is take a drive through the community and then come back and ask me some more questions. And it's working because they come back and they're like, now we understand. And I said, yeah, it's a different picture that you see in a news article or what they say in the news or the history books. I said, can you be my smoke signal? And they're like, what? Be my smoke signal. Can you go and tell 20 people what you see, who you talk to? Be honest. I said, because you know what? I said, we have to get past this. Well, I read it in a book, or one of my friends is a scholar. Everybody's a scholar about Native Americans, and I'm like, no, this doesn't work. It doesn't go that well. So real, where we're at on the reservation, it's having to nudge our own people to get back to who they are, and then explain or have people come to see where we're at. It's tough. Not everybody is wanting to, they've become comfortable. And it's frustrating sometimes. How do I get our people to move forward and to want better for themselves and for their family? How do we implement our traditions and our culture and our language? How do we implement making a change for the betterment of our communities? And one of the things that we also do is basically with our college students and with the community is just doing a lot of community work, getting our people to start doing volunteer. Money isn't everything. In our culture, it's we were very compassionate people, and getting our people to getting back into being compassionate again, and to help one another, to be there for each other. It's not an easy task, but it starts out because we have children that are watching us. We have grandchildren, and then we have our elders to take care of. So it's evolving, it's moving. I always say, if we're gonna move, we're gonna move everybody. We try not to leave anybody behind. Sometimes that happens, but more than anything, they'll catch up. They'll be right where everybody else is. More than anything, reservation, rural, city, urban, I try not to say our people are at the bottom of the totem pole, but we're here, we exist. I kind of find it funny, I've had visitors that natives are still here.
Yeah.
Yes. You don't live in a teepee? I'm like, no. This is a college? Yes. Anybody can go to school here? Yes. So we're breaking free from what scholars or what history books say who we are. And it doesn't come overnight. And more than anything, collaboration, working with others, working with all of you. And I also encourage you to come to Sitting Bull Visitor Center, come to Standing Rock. You're more than welcome to come to our classes. You're more than welcome to come visit. Indian country, I encourage everybody, if there's a reservation within your state, go visit it. Go visit, go learn, because you know what? We're not bad people. We're really good people. We're very, again, we're very compassionate people. And we want to do good too. We just need that encouragement. We need that collaboration. We need that resources. Again, we want to be past the status quo of they're the poorest Indians in the nation. We're really not poor. We're actually really rich. We're very creative. We have beautiful work. It's just getting our people to get back into that again, using their hands and using their mind. And of course, we're very spiritual, so it comes with prayer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ron.
So many segues. I feel really sad right now, to be quite honest. I feel really heavy this morning. So I'm gonna sing. Thanks. Bread of heaven, bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Bread of That's the song I learned growing up.
Thank you.
I grew up I grew up attending St. James Christian Methodist Episcopal Church in Perry, Georgia. It's a town about an hour and a half south of Atlanta. It's called the Crossroads of Central Georgia, which many I'm sure will appreciate the blues reference in that. I don't think it was the reference intention of the people who gave our town that nickname, but I've liked its devilish nature. So yeah, I grew up in this church. My great-grandmother, Lillian Timla Ragin, was the pianist in that church. So my family's been in Perry, Georgia for 6 generations, with me being 6. So sometime in the early 2010s, I got the memo, a spiritual memo, that said I needed to go back home and study this music that I grew up singing. And I'd loved these songs. I didn't know the names of them when I was a kid. These were just songs that elders would raise during service. But in the research that I had done in my time, I left home to go to college in the Bay Area, which is why I was like, Bay Area. I lived there for a cumulative 10 years. It was my second home. It's like, I need to go back and I need to really study this music. And I knew in my church, at least, that the elders were the ones who were holding down these traditions. It was never part of the order of service. It was just something somebody decided it was time to do, and we would just raise a hymn. And so I learned this has many titles, many ways of being called. Some people call them Dr. Watts hymns, which is associated with a very specific hymnal in which many of these songs were gifted. I don't know. This was all during the process of people being converted to Christianity while African folks were enslaved here. So there's the hymnal. It's called lining hymns, metered hymns, the old 100s. What'd you say? Gospel Pearls, okay. So many titles, but I was like, I need to go study. And so I started to talk to people about that and found some friends in Oakland who were willing to go on this journey with me and went home. And I go home to Perry. My grandparents still live there multiple times a year. But I went home with a very specific purpose, in this case, starting in 2015. And went back to my home church. It's like, I'm back. And I would be back. Like, I go to service when I go see my grandparents. I'm back, and I want to talk about this music. I want to sit with Mr. Harris and Mrs. Kendrick, who are the people who used to raise these hymns. and I wanna learn more. And they're like, oh, we don't sing those anymore. And I said, what am I gonna do? And so we talked about why. And I said, well, who else sings these songs? And my friends and I basically went on this like Sunday to Sunday journey. We would just show up in churches where we heard they still raise hymns, where they still line hymns. And we'd sit in the congregation, we'd stand up when they acknowledged the visitors and say where we were from. And if they sang the songs, if someone was lining a hymn during the service, we'd ask them if we could come back. And so that journey took us for many years now to many communities in central Georgia and in coastal Georgia and South Carolina, Gullah Geechee territory. And we've been sitting with people and asking them why they still sing these songs or why they don't. And a lot of what we've heard, this is called the Spiritual Technologies Project, spiritualtechnologies.org, if you want to check out some of the documentation we've done over these years. There's so many resonances with what folks have shared already, but people want to make their churches places where people want to go, and they don't feel like this music is going to attract anybody or keep them or retain them. And so rather than maintain this beautiful technology, to me, it's like there's nothing, like if all of us were doing that, what I just did together, which is the purpose, it's not a solo, it's a congregational form of singing, we would all be fucked up. Like it was like, we would all be crying, like everybody, like whatever you had to work out in your life that you haven't dealt with yet would be a puddle of tears and snot on the floor, and we'd have to all go get some fresh air and gather ourselves together. It's just phenomenal. And that's what it is. That's what it was designed to do. If you think about the context in which these songs originated and the conditions, I mean, this was therapy. That's what a lot of people told us. This is therapy when we asked them why this music is important. This is what keeps us together. That's why church service is so long, historically and contemporarily in some contexts, because this is the one place we have to let this stuff go. But people aren't singing these songs because they're old people songs. They're sad. I don't like the way, I don't understand what they're saying. Who knows the lyrics? But also because at the same time, what we noticed in all of these churches, and I mean, these are rural churches that are largely stewarding these traditions, elders in rural working class communities, land-based practices that are stewarding these traditions, like making mini mega churches. They're totally redoing the interiors. They're carpeting everything. They've got microphones now, whereas they didn't have them before. The wooden floor that you could stomp on has carpet on it now. You can't really stomp on it. And congregational singing in a context that's designed for amplified sound optimization sounds terrible. It just sounds bad. It sounds like you're singing alone in a studio. And so you don't get the technology anymore. It's not fun when you can't hear your neighbor singing. And so there's this way in which this urbanism and this centralization of value on the urban, on the commercializable, on the saleable, on the exportable or the extractable, has polluted, I'll say, even these rural church communities where it's like, well, if we just get a sound system, the people will stay. If we just get that choir that sings those praise and worship songs, the people will stay. It's not working. It's not working. And so I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about. That's what I wanted to talk about. There's so much connection, but this sense of extraction, repackaging, and then importing back, selling back, which has happened to so many communities, including rural communities, whether that be our natural resources, the things that come from the earth, or whether that be our cultural production and our art forms. If it can't be packaged and sold back, it's not valued oftentimes. And you can't package a metered hymn. Like, that's an experience that I don't know if too many people would necessarily pay for, because people don't necessarily want to be undone in front of everyone. I'm into that, but not everybody is. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ron. I unfortunately got the memo that wasn't spiritual, that we are running and we are out of time. And there is so much here, so much here. What I'm hearing, that, again, that part of equity is listening to everyone's story. We all have stories. And all of these folks, you'll all be traveling with us, will you? Catch Liegh after this. You can talk to him, but other folks will be around.
We'll be back tonight for the Smith Robertson.
He's coming back, so that's great. I'm going to ask Holly to kind of close, and for the funders in the room, I would love to hear Holly say a few of the recommendations that came. So listening is one of the recommendations, listening deeply. And Holly, what were others?
Looking at the picture, interior, your own organization, and then collectively in your community, understanding the pattern, making explicit goals to change those patterns, changing policies, changing practices, changing staff, changing whatever it takes to move those policies, and then monitoring, actually making yourself accountable. But I was talking to Matthew before this session started. Funders are important. We hope there are more who are taking this up and really embedding it in their practice. But you all have more power than you may realize if you act collectively. The rural generation is just one example. And I mean, Ron's hymn, it's the power in numbers that causes people to weep and drop to the floor and change their behavior. So I really encourage you to think about ways in which you together can approach clusters of funders, can approach people with resources, can make your case for a collaborative and much more, a larger and more effective distribution of resources. It's not the fun, don't wait for the funders.
Thank you. Help me to thank Ron Ragin, Jennifer Martell, Alex Gibson, Liegh McInnis, and Holly Sidford.